But we're really here to talk about how Western tech has and has not performed well in Ukraine and what some of the reasons are for that. We got people with some amazing perspectives on that. First, starting with the gentleman on my left, we have Brian McCarthy, who's Booz Allen's Senior Vice President and Managing Partner for Booz Allen's $300 million venture capital fund, Booz Allen Ventures, in addition to Booz Allen's tech scouting team, including its foreign technology intelligence practice. We also have Katerina Bondar. She's a fellow at the Wadwani AI Center at CSIS. Previously, she advised the government and president of Ukraine on defense and innovation reforms and held positions at Microsoft and PwC. To her left, we have Jeff Cole, founder and CEO of Hidden Level, where he works to advance emerging sensing technologies that support the Defense Department, aviation, and intelligence communications. And then, of course, we have Michael Kaufman, senior fellow in the Russia and Eurasia program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. And before Mike was at Carnegie, he led the Russia team at the Center for Naval Analyses. And you might also remember Mike from many, many episodes of the War on the Rocks podcast. I've lost count how many now at this point. We just recorded another one on Friday with Dara Massey-Coat that'll come out tomorrow. So don't miss that one. But we're here to talk about Ukraine. Brian, you have to look at a lot of companies, especially since the size of your venture fund tripled, that are coming to you and saying, hey, our tech is doing this in Ukraine and our tech is doing that in Ukraine, and it's helping the people of Ukraine, helping them fight in Ukraine. How do you assess what's actually happening? Because this is something that I hear a lot. Companies always come to me in private conversations usually say, listen, our company's doing great in Ukraine. It's all the other ones that have the problems. And every company says that, of course, and not every company can be telling the truth. So how do you make these assessments as an investor?
It's a great question. I think getting beyond the bumper sticker, press releases of, U.S. dual-use companies who are operational in Ukraine is really at the center of that question. I can think of very few companies who are on the front lines, operating in Ukraine right now. We have a very large contract Booz does, helping the security assistance cooperation in Ukraine. But personally, from a ventures perspective, I think what you have to do is you got to get behind, the press releases and say, all right, who has actually shipped gear over there, is operational, and has experience on the ground. And I think in the last 2.5 years, I've met maybe less than a handful of founders who have done that. We have one here, Brian from Vermeer, who's living over there. There's a couple of other companies who have said, like, we're going to actually, pick up our bags and head over and be on the ground. And then we can get, and I know with my other panelists, into a lot of the technical details, incentive details as to, why or why not. But I think it's a real concern for me as to when folks who have said they have been over there and have been operational with their tech. I think there's several layers of that onion that you need to peel back.
And Jeff, as you know, as a company that's in, I guess you could call it the emitting space, but one of the things that Ukraine does is subjects and tests the material that gets sent over there from Western companies to a variety of EW measures and testing ranges. And how familiar are you with these measures, and how well, in your experience, do some of these companies hold up?
Yeah, it's a great question. The EW side of things in that particular part of the world is really advanced from, I think, where people thought it was going to be. A lot of technology that works in controlled environments gets over there and can really struggle. There's so much advancements in electronic warfare that you're now seeing a lot of that being replicated at test ranges here as well, trying to push technology to the limits and see what it can do and what it can't do. But it's also driving innovation as well. A lot of the more simple technology will definitely struggle in that environment, especially where there's broad jamming, or if you're emitting a signal, it's easy to target and you're interfered with. But that said, there is some pretty incredible technology as well, especially in the passive nature that's growing in awareness due to what's going on over there right now.
And for you, this is, of course, both personal and professional. I would love to get some of your perspectives. And also, a lot of the times when we think about what technologies are being fielded over there, we think about drones. And drones are obviously important, but there's obviously more than just Western drones being sent over there. There's actually quite a lot of other solutions and technologies.
Yes, of course, there is a huge variety of technologies that are being tested in Ukraine. And I think when we're talking about presence of Western companies in Ukraine, we should actually start, and if we want to evaluate like our panelists called, if they fail or not, and if they fail, why, we have to first think about the reasons why they're present there. And from my communication with the Ukrainian military, I actually see three main reasons why Western companies are present there. So one is, of course, technology testing. It's pretty straightforward. Ukraine is a testing ground, the best testing ground currently against sophisticated electronic warfare, denied environment, etc. But there's another motivation is, for example, get into Ukrainian markets. So there are a lot of companies who are trying to figure it out how to sell to Ukrainian government and to actually participate in combat. And there's a lot of obstacles there. And if we're talking about failing or not, it's not only about the company, it's also about conditions. It's about acquisition system in Ukraine, procurement system in Ukraine. And the third reason is actually marketing, because for many Western companies, I'm not talking only about the American companies here, I'm talking mostly about European companies. It's a marketing strategy. So they get there, they kind of test their technology in the battlefield, get this label battlefield tested, and try to sell to their governments. So I see two sides of this problem, actually. And I think we should talk, and I think we will talk about different motivations why companies are there. And depending on these motivations, if we can evaluate and we can assess if their technologies actually fail or not. And of course, it doesn't matter what kind of technology, is it drones or AI for data analysis, situational awareness, OSINT systems, sensors, all sorts of things. I think what is really important is what Western companies are trying to achieve there. And that's how we can actually figure it out, what's working, what's not, and separate it into big buckets of problems and failures or success stories.
Mike, you have, I think that's a good segue into your perspective. You, of course, for those that don't know, Mike, you and a small team of other military analysts go to Ukraine every quarter and beyond Kyiv, but to different parts of the front and deal directly with units fielding these technologies, which gives you a kind of unique perspective all the way from the strategic level down to the operational and tactical level. So what have you been learning in terms of how these technologies have perhaps not been, from the West specifically, realizing their full potential?
Sure. So just to reinforce what Marina said, I do think that a lot of Western companies in Ukraine are doing what they came there to do, which is primarily to test their technology, to test it in the field, and then to develop it further, and ideally to iterate it. And also they've been given a clear demand signal that many government procurement sort of side folks are not interested in technology unless it has been tested in Ukraine. And so they are looking not just to brand themselves that way, but also because there's a sense that you have to have been there. I think that's a good thing. Okay, that being said, because I don't necessarily think that a lot of companies are failing in Ukraine, a lot of them are actually in Ukraine doing what they want to do. My experience sort of dealing with technology, and I come across it at lots of different levels, is that, to be frank, a lot of technology that Western companies bring to Ukraine at first iteration tends not to do well. It's usually the second or third iteration of the product as they iterate that starts to do a lot better. And so it takes time to get more accurate information and impressions on how much it has improved. Usually the list of issues that I tend to see, if I was to kind of run through it, would be first, a lot of Western companies don't necessarily understand what value their product brings, and if it's competitive with something that Ukrainians themselves have already built and developed that's already more effective, works better, works simpler, or is much cheaper to employ. Second, a lot of the issues are from execution, deployment side problems, Ryan. Sometimes folks early on just give their technology to somebody and hope for the best, and they don't get any feedback, okay? The best companies that are most successful, they deploy a team of people who are going to be in Ukraine, at least in Kiev, that will be in touch, collecting data, talking with the folks using their products rather than just sort of handing it to somebody and then hoping that this unit figures out what to do with it and how to use it. Next, unfortunately, most of them deploy a very small amount of the technology they brought. They usually give it to some very, very elite unit. And this unit will employ it in one specific case, maybe on one specific operational axis, in a very narrow kind of use case. And that's where they're getting their information from, rather than having more things or handing it out to a diversity of units. Because Ukraine is a very diverse operating environment. If you've been on one battlefield in Ukraine, that's all you've seen. You've seen one phase of the war in one particular geography, over one type of terrain, against a certain type of forces. And you may feel like you've tested it in Ukraine, but maybe you were not even testing on a secondary axis. Maybe you might have been testing it in a fairly light environment compared to where much of the fighting is. So you have to be really thoughtful, and you have to make sure that this product actually made its way around Ukraine. A lot of that has to do with follow-through issues from my point of view. Last, I think it's great Marina mentioned that if it comes to sort of selling to Ukraine as a market, most companies I know that come to Ukraine don't see Ukraine as their primary market. They see Ukraine as a development area for the market they're looking to pursue in the West. But in Ukraine itself, despite the reputation of being in a very agile environment, which is very true in terms of units, every unit being its own development lab and having its own supply chain and having its own let's say, assembly that might furnish them with drones and equipment. When it comes to the Ukrainian government, there are a lot of constraints and restrictions on certifications that often make it take it an unreasonably long amount of time to get drones or any other types of products actually certified by procurement for MOD, so much so that's actually not very agile. I won't get into that because Marina has more thoughts on it.
Not necessarily a question or statement, but an opinion. But I also think we have over exercised our ability to lawyer everything up. So our export control laws have become problematic to a point where shipping what's actually needed has been blocked, number one. Non-program of record systems and technologies that could be easily used over there. There's been a lack of there's no, to my knowledge, environment in which, all the U.S. dual-use companies could have a catch-all come in, get through an expedited process, and have something at the back end so that they could, interface with the right folks from the Ministry of Defense over there, really get kind of this understanding of exactly what's needed on the front lines, be able to test and iterate quickly on the front lines, which is a problem. But we're also, and this isn't necessarily to be a catch-all for all, U.S. dual-use technology companies, but for the most part, we are designing for program of record big contracts. And part of the problem is when you do that, you build exquisite systems that cost a lot, that are generally meant to not be attritable, and that is not necessarily what's needed to fight over there. And so I think that's a problem as well. But I've not been on the ground. I think all these three people have spent considerable more time on the ground. I don't know if they would agree with any of that.
Do you think we are biased towards assessing, at least in public source analysis, the things that we see? We talk a lot about drones, as I mentioned before, but there are, Jeff, to take hidden level, for example, there are lots of solutions that are not visible that we know play an important role in the sensing EW world that may be more successful. It's just harder to talk about publicly, or we are comfortable with the success stories to the extent that we don't talk about them that much anymore, except when it becomes a political controversy. So I'm thinking of SpaceX, which has obviously been very important to Ukraine since the beginning of the war. So is it maybe a better story than we think on some things, and that we're biased towards some of the more difficult hardware-centric technologies that are meant to blow up and deliver autonomous effects?
I'll jump in there and say absolutely across all aspects. Some of the things that have been successful over there, yeah, are harder to talk about. But also to the point of both of the panelists here talking about what is the mission you're trying to solve. It can be a lot of people are trying to get in there for sometimes just because they want to say their tech was there, was battle hardened. But is it actually meeting the broader mission? Is it ready to scale? Are they getting the feedback fast enough? There's a lot of conversation around that part of it, but there are things that are working pretty well. To Brian's point, I would agree that there is no easy button to get technology over there necessarily quickly. A lot of companies are entirely new to the export process and procurement channels and structure. And they may get technology that actually could be super helpful, but it's only gotten to one small part of the force and only seen a small part of the battle, which is challenging. It's difficult. I think there is a lot of success stories as much as there are things that you hear people wanting to talk about are the failures. But the failures are also driving innovation change, they're driving procurement change, and they're driving discussions like we're having right now.
Yeah, well, I would just add that failures, they attract a lot of attention in media. That's always easier to focus on failures. But there are also a lot of success stories, and that's true that Ukraine uses a lot of foreign technology, and it's not that visible, and maybe it's not that fancy and sexy to talk about in the media. But for example, a lot of Ukrainian data, let's put it that way, is stored in cloud services of Amazon, of Microsoft. And for example, Microsoft was helping and supporting Ukraine since the beginning of the war in 2014. I was working in Microsoft. I personally witnessed that, and there was a lot of migration related to beginning of hostilities in Donbass region, and it helped to migrate a lot of data from that region, which go on to government services. So these stories are just not that popular, but they really make a difference, and I think we should talk a little bit more about it in the media as well, and the role of big tech primes, if I may say so, in this conflict. But yeah, I mean, Ukraine is in generally famous for this agility, as was mentioned before, but it also poses a lot of challenges because Ukrainian procurement system, Ukrainian acquisition is very decentralized. And for example, if we're talking about some structured, regular, sustainable experimentation on Ukrainian battlefield, here we should establish some processes and procedures, maybe on intergovernmental level, where we allow companies to do this, and we actually allow to test these technologies at scale in different environments, in different parts of the battlefield, because the battlefield is huge and conditions on different parts are very different, and the need in technologies is very different. So to actually start this testing collaboration between the US and Ukraine, I think we should first achieve this agreement on intergovernmental level. Then we need to structure this process from the MOD across military units. Because without this, it will be as it is right now, ad hoc, not structured, not regular, and basically it's a burden of every single company separately to go there to find contacts. That's why it's so. Then there's so few testing, and you found contact of a brigade or a commander, and they agreed to test. So that's your feedback. So I think it's just a bit higher level problem rather than collaboration between companies and them going there. So if we want to get full feedback and full advantage from this battle, the decision should be made on higher government level.
All right, well, so what I'd add is, I think a lot of companies are selling that they were in Ukraine, but very few are honest about the failures and how their technology really performed. And one thing that people should keep in mind is actually Ukrainians are masters of data collection and data entry. And believe it or not, they have very good records on what happened with the drones, with the systems they use, and they are available. And that's one thing, Rand, I try to do, to the extent that one can objectively referee as an analyst, to get stories from different people who are actual users to find out how things perform. It's not one of the primary reasons folks like me are in Ukraine, but it's definitely an interest to see how that compares with the stories companies themselves tell. If I was going to add maybe a couple other challenges I tend to see, is often it has to do with partners companies pick. And sometimes they pick local co-development partners and it doesn't work out. They deploy some localized version of their technology. Also, EW. EW is a big problem, but I will tell you, EW is the number one thing companies blame for their products not working when they issue something else. It's also the number one thing troops blame when they don't use the product or the military technology correctly, because it's the easiest thing to blame. And there are plenty of times when I see companies blaming adversary EW when their product simply isn't well made, just being frank. Their product doesn't initialize half the time it's launched out of the tube, and it's not EW at all. And there are a lot of stories like that where when you start digging, you quickly find out that EW is an excuse for other technological challenges or production challenges that they're facing, or employment challenges. And folks like me tend to discern those pretty fast. Is it really adversary EW, or are there other issues with the technology as it's being used?
Yeah, that's one of the real challenges that I think you just touched on very well, Mike. And we've talked about a lot of this a lot privately, is how you take the sort of marketing, public communications language of many of these companies that we want to see succeed, but and then be like, well, is it really going that well? And then what data do we actually have available to us, especially in the public sphere? It's very hard to make these judgments.
Yeah, and the other side of the story is also true. There are sometimes companies that get a bad rep for their initial tech not working, but then they've worked on it, and the second and third iteration actually is doing quite well. And that story needs to catch up with the fact that whatever they initially put into Ukraine wasn't very competitive or did not work in that environment. I also hear quite a bit of that. So there's challenges in that. Folks who were first movers went in first, second year, their initial technology didn't do well, but by the third, and now we're going maybe into the fourth year, actually the iteration of the product now is starting to do a lot better.
I'm so glad you brought up the data collection. If you go 2 blocks north of us, you'll go to the convention center, and every single person in there will know what Maven Smart System is. But Maven Smart System isn't built on an operational test bed in an EW environment that we can replicate very easily. And I'm so curious because we've spent a bunch of time with the Ukrainian MOD, and they actually built Maven Smart System that works. And I wonder why we are still sitting here wondering why we can't get access to that data and have some kind of agreement between the two countries so that all that drone data can be pulled into systems that we can access and use. And it just seems such a low barrier of entry to create some data sharing agreement, but to my knowledge, it hasn't been done.
I think that it's also about working with other countries as well. So, for example, I know a lot of the Baltic countries get a lot of this pristine, high-fidelity data from Ukraine on weapons performance data, and they actually will send people into Ukraine, their own MOD personnel, which we do not, to get some of this data firsthand, which unfortunately the U.S. government and Defense Department now under 2 administrations has made the choice not to do, which sort of limits our official understanding of what these companies are doing as well. And so creates this cycle where the government here is reliant on companies to tell them what they're doing and what they're not doing well. Is there any fix to that beyond the U.S. having a more, at least forward analytical posture in Ukraine?
Well, I can answer why it hasn't happened. And I think the main obstacle is the Ukrainian side, actually both. Well, but Ukrainian side, the general position is that, yes, we have a lot of data. We collect that data. We read that data is the new oil, but we don't know how to monetize it yet. So basically, Ukrainian MOD doesn't have a vision how to share this data, for what purpose, what they can get out of it. So that's understandable. On the other hand, when I talk to the US military, I hear a lot of arguments saying that actually that data is not that useful for us because our theater is going to be in the ocean, it's in the Pacific. So what do we have to do with the data coming from fields or the forests of Ukraine? That's not our next war. So it's actually both sides from my point of view and from what I see. But yeah, Ukrainians probably need some help in structuring this deal and understanding the value of the data.
Yeah, I'll add the data is, it is, as you said, the new oil, right? There's definitely picking and choosing of what data is relevant or useful based on what theater you're operating in, how strategies are going to play out, etc. And the things that do start working well, the data around that isn't talked about as much and definitely is more siloed at that point. But I think you have to step back a layer and look at what data do we have that's actually public facing, that's useful. To some of the things you were mentioning around technology is that was going there and failing right away. Some of it early on was, well, I was expecting to have GPS. I have GPS everywhere. No, you won't. Figure that one out and then let's get started. And then people start working through those challenges. But yeah, you've got INDOPACOM, you've got CENTCOM, SOUTHCOM, NORTHCOM, EUCOM. Those combat theaters are all very unique and different things are going to happen in those environments. There's a bit of what data is relevant for my particular need and what data do I want to hang on to for my own personal need as well, to some of the things you were referencing. So it is, I'll say it can be a shame that we don't have a better way of sharing it all and co-collaborating and understanding how things that are playing out in an area that may not seem relevant to a different theater actually are. But that said, I can say at a lot of events we've been at recently, there's been Ukrainian operators bringing experience and data and knowledge in their head and showing, well, this is how it's playing out in our theater, and this is what's happening. And it is pushing the limits of that technology and actually forcing change. So
I'd like to take a couple of questions from the audience.
Generally just want to understand, at least for the small companies that are trying to get into Ukraine with their services, are there any sort of language barriers that they're running into? Are primes helping with that at all? I just wonder what's happening. I'll get it all with it. Thank you.
Language barriers, is that a real issue at this point?
I think it's very easy to solve. The main barrier I see is just not knowing how to operate in Ukraine, who to work with there, right? What's the right way to deploy your technology, how to follow up and get feedback on it and like iterate, right? What are the things to do and what are the things not to do? And I see a lot of companies still, 2025, kind of struggling with the basics of it, of how to get in there. And it's already a pretty well-trodden path from my point of view for a lot of folks. And so, and then also like, what are you trying to get out of it really? Like, how much stuff are you trying to bring in? Are you going to have people there or not? Some companies, bigger ones, can afford to have a whole office in Kiev or somewhere else and do testing of various kinds. Other people can't. So then it's a big challenge for them of picking the right local partner because they're not going to have a whole office there to follow up. And then who do you come to talk to try to make that work, right? Because the biggest challenge, if you don't have any contacts in Ukraine, how do you figure that out? And your potential competitors do. One thing, Ryan, if you'll indulge me, I didn't mention this, but I will make an observation. So I think this is not a reason at all why Western companies fail, but as an observation that I've had, is some Western companies who compete in Europe or United States come to Ukraine, and because of this legacy rivalry, compete with each other in Ukraine for absolutely no reason. They don't have any of the capability to fill the market, but they don't like each other. So they'll show up and it's like an empty swimming pool and each of them both have one bucket and they have no chance of filling the swimming pool of demand at all. But they spend half their time explaining why the other guy's bucket isn't good, in the water, and theirs not good either. And they don't have the ability to actually meet Ukraine's demand, and it's not going to be their primary market anyway, but they show up in Ukraine and start competing with each other.
Yeah, I don't think there's a language barrier. I think there's more clarity barrier on why you're there and what you're trying to do. Being really upfront about what your technology can do and what it can't do and what your intent is. It's unfortunate to see, as you're referencing, companies that go there just to compete with one another when the reality is they're probably better together. And just talking about what their strengths and weaknesses are and being really transparent. I don't think it's much of a communication barrier as much as it's what's your actual intent, being clear with that.
Yeah, and it's gotten a lot better. I mean, I went with Mike on his first analytical trip to Ukraine back in October 2022, right? And it was remarkable how even back then, companies you've heard of were reaching out to me, being like, we're trying to get stuff to Ukraine. Can you help us? I'm like, surely you have a better solution than me. And at that point they did. Now they do. Now there's channels that have been established. The Ukrainian government's gotten a lot better. Not as good as they need to, but better. So it's never really a language issue.
Yeah, and the last thing maybe that I could add is Western companies should not only come, but kind of build trust and relations with Ukrainians, because due to all the factors that were mentioned before, and like I talk to the military people on the front line, and what I hear is that, yeah, we see that they bring stuff, they want us to test it, and then they just disappear. And then we don't get this in bulk, like we don't have any supplies of something that we're testing. Like, what's the point for us to test if we won't be able to fight with it? So we're kind of providing these services, but we don't get anything out of it. And just in case we're fighting the war. So they're kind of busy. So building trust, communication, not only through language, and building this long-term communication for a continuous iteration. That's what Ukrainians are expecting. And that's what really raised value to them. So
Great. We have another question right here.
I almost have flashbacks of Afghanistan, because there were a lot of people flying out to Afghanistan to put on the battle royale and get their ticket punched and get a photo. And these are policy people. And then all of a sudden, I mean, people in this town to this day were like, well, I was in Afghanistan. And so, I mean, in your experience, and this operational tail and the trust building, like if you're just there to get your tech out there to say, well, we're in Ukraine, we're battle tested in Ukraine, right? You come, you drop your box, mission accomplished. How many people in your experience are taking stuff to Ukraine to get their ticket punched versus, actually getting into ops and, doing business and sustainment?
I'm going to answer this from a venture perspective. And from a venture perspective, in scouting about 1,000 companies a year, we've seen probably less than 10 that have gone there, boots on the ground, and been successful, which means that the other 90% of the companies that we've seen have done it for the bumper sticker, the punch card, whatever. And there could be all these other reasons and factors that we talked about today that make it really difficult. But from the venture perspective, and we didn't go into this deeply, but the incentive structure for a company to go and raise money off saying being battle tested, what you just said is enough. Unfortunately, and this might be controversial, but most venture investors who are in this space or new to this space cannot tell the difference.
yeah, I'll just agree to that. I don't have numbers or a ratio, but unfortunately, it's a very common phenomenon. And in Ukrainian military, they even have a term for this, military tourists. So people dropping off stuff or taking pictures and then writing articles about how successful they are. Yeah, that exists. And like from my conversations, I always ask, what are the companies who you work with and whose stuff you're actually using in the battle? And I can give you names like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And that's basically it, out of maybe hundreds who come there from Western world. So yes, it exists. What to do with that? I have no answer, but that's the reality.
Yeah, I just want to add, there are mission-driven defense founders, and there are people there's kind of a gold rush in defense tech right now. And it's very hard to tell the difference between the ones who are cynical and mission-driven these days. And that happens a lot when there's a new kind of unregulated frontier. We can go back to the gold rush. It attracts lots of different kinds of personalities, the actual gold rush. And it also depends what stage a company's at. So if you are at the early stage and you're talking to Brian and his venture colleagues, what is success for you? Well, if you're mission driven, it's, I want to build this great technology that's going to contribute to my country's military, maybe help Ukraine along the way. And if you're in it, it's for really the money. It's about getting that seed round or that A round. And you're just focused on that. And so it depends what your actual internal incentives are. And unfortunately, there's a lot of cynical people out there right now.
There's very much a perverse incentive system. And if you are in Ukraine and see the challenge of doing this right, you see that most companies are not going to be able to actually do it and to figure it out, given how many companies are trying to be in the space. And from my own experience, very few units are actually using Western products. And the number is very small and very identifiable. And then oftentimes, even when you talk to folks from major Western companies who say, we gave a product, who did you give it to? Well, we gave it in so-and-so unit. And it's like, no, you didn't. Okay, a lot of folks then have to follow up themselves internally to find out who did they actually give it to, because many of them don't even know where it really is. Like, they haven't fully figured it out. And what they sometimes don't appreciate is, it's not that hard to follow up to find out how the stuff is doing, who you gave it to, okay, what they thought of it, and they should all keep that in mind. Like, not that there's a lot of people doing it, but Ukraine is very far contextually from Afghanistan. It's not hard at all to follow this up and to figure it out on the back end.
Wondering if you've seen use of autonomy at all in the field, and if so, what? And if not, what are the barriers and how far away are we from autonomous system to fear?
Could you be just a little more specific in autonomy and what sort of solutions?
AI-driven targeting and kinetic effects, I suppose. Is that specific?
Sure.
Yeah, so there's no full autonomy on the battlefield yet. There was a claim made by, there was a Russian drone which was captured by Ukrainians, analyzed, and that was kind of the first case when fully autonomous system was deployed. It was in June this year, so that's the information that we have. Based on my research on the systems that they use in Ukraine, there's no full autonomy yet. There is kind of parts of autonomy, separate functions, as you said, targeting, autonomous navigation, ATR, last mile solutions, that's what they call. So they exist separately. They might be integrated into different platforms. They might be integrated in ISR drones and kamikazes, FPV drones, whatever. But there's no full autonomous system. And I just want to, I keep saying this all the time because there's so much hype in the media, AI wars and killer robots. We're not there yet. This tech is super hard. And that's why we've seen fiber optic drones, for example, because it's way easier to enable connection by simply connecting a cable to a drone rather than developing this hard, sophisticated software. So what Ukrainians and Russians use is basically open source technology. For autonomous navigation, they use open source technology. For drone racing, for drone racing, for ATR, they use computer vision models, and they train on data sets that they spray from social media. So it's not a very high-tech environment, cutting-edge environment, unfortunately. So I don't think we'll see full autonomy anytime soon. And there's a lot of questions related to practical application and deployment, because given that now we have this information about fully autonomous drone used by Russians, a lot of questions arise. How do you actually use it? How do you assign a target? Do you assign a target, or you just, if it's AI enabled, so basically it can make a decision by itself how to achieve the goal that you set, but you don't tell how to do this. So is it really safe? Will it actually complete the mission? And there are so many questions, and neither Russians nor Ukrainians have answers to that. So the question is, everyone is trying to achieve full autonomy, and that's going to be kind of the new stage in this war, right? But nobody has answers how to actually deploy this technology and how to use this technology. And that's one of the obstacles that I see, despite all the technical issues that we have for now.
Jeff, did you want to add anything? No?
I'll add a little bit here. I think you covered everything pretty well. There are situations where autonomy is being used to help with decision making in smaller aspects, because you're trying to make decisions very quickly. So using some autonomy to, whether it's fusing data information together so that an operator can make a decision quicker, but end-to-end autonomy, there's still a lot of challenges there to be figured out. But there are places where you're seeing autonomy be used for very rapid decision-making and threat analysis.
Great. Well, with that, let's give our panelists a big round of applause.